My Uncle Raymond isn't the kind of man who tells stories for fun. He's a retired Navy engineer who spent the better part of his life working in maritime, maintenance lighthouses, offshore rigs, buoy networks, that kind of stuff. The man doesn't even believe in ghosts. He's sharp, logical, old school. So when he told me this story, he prefaced it by saying, "I don't want you to think I've lost it. I can't explain what happened. I just want you to hear it." This happened in 2015 off the coast of Northern California. There's a small island out there called Grayson Point, barely more than a chunk of rock and scrub sticking out of the Pacific. It's home to an old lighthouse that's been decommissioned since the late 90s, but the structure still stands. And the Coast Guard maintains basic access for safety and historical reasons. My uncle had been contracted through a civilian firm to do a routine inspection of the foundation and assess storm damage after a particularly rough winter. The trip was supposed to last 3 days, max. Just him and a younger assistant named Miguel. The plan was simple: get dropped off by boat, stay in the small caretaker's shack, inspect the tower, document any damage, and radio back for pickup. They were dropped off on a Thursday morning. The weather was typical for the area: cloudy, damp with a sharp wind, but nothing dangerous. The shack was small but serviceable. One room with a bunk bed, an old stove, and not much else. The lighthouse itself was maybe 150 feet away, up a crumbling path lined with rusted railings and moss. My uncle said the first day was uneventful. The tower was old but mostly intact. Somewhere on the exterior, bird nests rust along the metal fixtures. Nothing alarming. They went through their usual checklist, tested the structural supports, noted down the erosion around the base. The light was obviously long defunct, the glass lens cracked and dirtied from years of neglect. It wasn't until that night that something strange happened. Miguel woke Raymond up around 2:15 a.m., saying he thought he saw the lighthouse beacon flash. Just once. A single pulse of light that cut through the fog and then vanished. Raymond thought the kid was dreaming. There was no power to the tower, and the lens had been removed years ago. But Miguel was certain. He said it didn't look like a flashlight or lightning, just a slow, deliberate sweep like the old beacon used to do. Raymond told him to go back to bed, chalked it up to nerves or imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time Raymond saw it too. He was up late reading a manual when he noticed the faintest glow pass across the inside wall of the shack, like a light beam from outside sweeping slowly. He stepped outside, and there it was. The lighthouse was glowing, not fully lit, but pulsing softly like the lens was struggling to fire. He couldn't believe it. He walked all the way up the path and climbed the tower, flashlight in hand. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. The generator was disconnected, the wiring stripped. There was no chance this thing could be working. But still, every few minutes, that light would pulse dim like a heartbeat. He said it gave him a sinking feeling in his gut, like something was trying to wake up. He didn't tell Miguel about it the next morning. Day 3, they wrapped up their inspection and decided to call in for early pickup. The air had gotten heavier, and they both felt weirdly agitated, like they'd been breathing in something stale. But the radio was dead. No signal. The backup battery wasn't charging either, which didn't make sense. So they had no choice but to wait another night. That evening, it got worse. Around midnight, Miguel started hearing footsteps above them on the shack's roof. At first, they assumed it was gulls or maybe the wind shifting debris. But then the steps descended, moving from the roof to the porch, then around the outside of the shack. Slow, heavy, like boots on wet wood. Raymond grabbed his flashlight and flung the door open. Nothing. The island was empty. But when he looked up toward the lighthouse, the beacon was fully spinning. He swears on his life that the light was moving in a full rotation, just like it had when it was operational. But it wasn't casting a clean light, it was warped, dim and fragmented, like it was struggling to shine through something thick. Water or glass or maybe fog that wasn't really fog, just density. They stayed inside that night, armed with a crowbar and a hatchet. Neither of them slept. The next morning, the light was off again. They packed their gear and tried the radio one last time. Still dead. That's when they saw the boat. It wasn't the Coast Guard, just a small fishing trawler anchored a few hundred yards offshore. There was no radio contact, no reply to signals. But around 10 a.m., it began drifting away slowly, like whoever had brought it had just left. They never saw a person aboard. Raymond hiked back up to the lighthouse one last time, hoping to find any clue. Maybe someone had come ashore and messed with the wiring. Maybe there was a logical reason for all of it. But inside the tower, something had changed. The floor was wet, not like rain or ocean spray fully soaked. And in the center of the room, someone had arranged old electrical wires and rusted screws in a circle, like a nest or a symbol. No footprints, no tools, just that. He said something about it made him feel like he was being watched. Not just by something inside the tower, but by the tower itself. When the Coast Guard finally arrived the next day, Raymond didn't mention most of it. Just that they'd had power failures and strange activity. The boat crew dismissed it. Said the island always creeped people out. But here's the kicker. A week later, when the crew reviewed the satellite scans from the area, there was a single frame, just one, captured at 2:13 a.m. on the night the beacon was seen again. In it, the Grayson Point Lighthouse was lit. Fully, brightly, just like it had been 20 years ago. And standing at the base of the tower, just outside the door, was the faint outline of a man in a coat. This story comes from a man named Travis. He's the brother of a former co-worker of mine, and he used to work for a private maritime restoration firm out of Nova Scotia. A quiet guy, very polite. He always gave the impression of someone who'd seen too much and had no interest in impressing anyone with it. He told me this story one evening after we started talking about old lighthouses and the strange things people experience out on remote islands. It was the only time I've ever seen him visibly uncomfortable telling a story. I didn't press him too hard, but what he told me has never left my mind. This happened in 2009. Travis had been hired to restore the interior of a lighthouse on a stretch of barren rock called Bleakstone Point, an isolated spit of land in the North Atlantic about 40 miles offshore. The lighthouse there had been decommissioned in 1984 after a string of unexplained equipment failures. And since then, it had just sat out there, forgotten and rotting. The structure was slated for restoration by a private preservation group. They wanted it cleaned, photographed, and made safe for occasional tours in the summer season. Travis was sent out alone for a 4-day preliminary assessment with a sat phone and a marine radio as backup. The plan was simple: photograph the structure, assess interior hazards, and catalog anything of historical value. A supply boat would drop him off Monday and return Friday. Right away, he noticed something strange about the place. Even from the boat, as they approached, the lighthouse looked wrong. It leaned slightly, not enough to be dangerous, but just enough to make it feel unnatural. As if it were resisting gravity in its own quiet way. The rocks around the base were jagged and dark, covered in slimy algae that looked like they hadn't dried in years, and the wind didn't blow right. He said that multiple times. The wind didn't blow right. The supply crew dropped him off and left without ceremony. The island was dead quiet. The first day was just exploration. The tower's door had been chained shut by the Coast Guard, but Travis cut the lock. Inside, it was musty and smelled of salt, mildew, and something else he couldn't place. The kind of sour, stagnant scent you get in old root cellars or crypts. He didn't like the narrowness of the stairs or the way the light never quite made it to the corners of the rooms. The tower had 5 levels. The first was a storage area. The second and third had old furniture and filing cabinets rusted shut, their papers decaying into wet clumps. The fourth was a tiny living space, complete with a cot and rusted cookware. The fifth, of course, was the lantern room. That night, he slept in a canvas tent outside the lighthouse instead of inside it. Not because he was scared, he said, but because the interior just felt off. The second day, he spent time on the 4th level, documenting old personal items. There was a small bookshelf with sea-weathered journals, a cracked porcelain mug, and, strangest of all, a photo. It was sitting face down on the shelf, stuck to the wood with dried salt. He peeled it off carefully. It was a picture of a man in a dark coat standing next to the lighthouse, squinting in the sun. Nothing strange at first, until Travis looked closer. The man's eyes weren't just closed from sunlight. They were gone, black pits in the photograph. Not scratched out, not smudged, just empty sockets. He set the photo aside and tried to convince himself it was just water damage. Later that afternoon, he was up in the lantern room when he heard someone walking below. The creaking was soft at first, then firmer, step by step. Travis assumed the Coast Guard had come back to check in, maybe a miscommunication. He shouted down the spiral stairwell. No answer. He descended slowly, step by step, expecting to find someone on the third level. It was empty, but the photo he'd left on the shelf was now lying face up on the floor. That night, Travis slept inside. He said he wasn't afraid, just annoyed at himself for getting jumpy. But around 1 a.m., something woke him, the sound of scraping, metal on stone. It echoed up from below, deep and rhythmic. He thought maybe the wind had knocked something loose, so he grabbed his flashlight and descended. What he found was the chain, the very chain he'd cut off the main door on the first day, had somehow been rewrapped around the inside of the front door. Not from the outside, from within. And at the end of the chain was a small bell, rusted but intact. It swayed gently, as if something had just let go of it. Travis backed away slowly and returned to the top of the tower. He considered radioing for an early pickup, but the signal was filled with static. Nothing intelligible? The next day was overcast, the fog never lifted. He decided to finish his documentation and then hunker down until pickup. Around noon, he returned to the third level to photograph the walls, which were covered in soot from an old fire. But that's when he saw it. Someone had scratched something into the wall, letters. Still here. It hadn't been there the day before, he was sure of it. The words had been gouged in deeply fresh, clean marks against the soot-darkened wall. The height of the letters was strange, too low, like a child or someone crawling on their hands and knees had made them. He left the lighthouse after that. Spent the last night in the tent again, barely sleeping. Every now and then he swore he heard the bell ringing faintly in the dark, even though there was no wind. On the morning of the pickup, the fog broke just as the boat appeared. He didn't say a word to the crew as he climbed aboard. But later that evening, once he was back on the mainland, he opened his camera to begin transferring photos to his laptop. And he found something that shouldn't have been there. Amid the photos of rusted beams, water-damaged logs, and crumbling walls, was a single photo he hadn't taken. A photo of the lantern room, shot from the outside, from high above. And standing behind the cracked glass in perfect focus was the same man from the old photograph. Only this time, his eyes were open. This one comes from a man named Ethan, who reached out to a Maritime podcast I follow. He didn't want to be interviewed, didn't want his full name shared, just wanted the story out there. He sent it in as a voice memo, and the podcast host later read it on air with permission. It stayed with me ever since. Ethan was a sonar technician with the Navy until around 2016. After retiring, he took a civilian job through a private defense contractor. His work focused on signal triangulation, basically using sonar and communication frequencies to locate lost equipment, submarines, or even black boxes from downed aircraft. Most of it was uneventful. Long hours staring at data, identifying false positives, recalibrating sensors, until he got sent to a remote stretch of the Oregon coastline, Cape Vanish. That's not its real name, he made that clear, but it's what locals had called it for generations. Cape Vanish is home to a lighthouse that hasn't operated since 1971. When the keeper was found dead at the base of the tower, his injuries were never fully explained. Officially, it was called an accidental fall, but the autopsy noted fractures to both legs, one wrist, and oddly signs of prolonged exposure, as if he hadn't died immediately. Ethan was never interested in that part of the story. He was there to track down a rogue sonar ping that had been picked up intermittently over several months by offshore listening buoys. It was faint, low frequency, and repeating in odd patterns, 3 pulses, then 2, then 1. Always from the same area, directly beneath the cliffs of the lighthouse. The Navy wanted to know if it was equipment malfunction, or something else. So Ethan was flown in alone with a portable sonar rig, laptop, and gear for a 3-day stay. There was a small generator shed still functional so he could power his equipment. The lighthouse tower itself had long been sealed off, but he was given a master key to access it if needed. The first day was quiet. He calibrated his equipment and checked the coastal rock formations to make sure no natural echo chambers were creating false positives. Everything looked normal until 3:12 a.m. that night. That's when the signal returned. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, pause, 1. Then silence. Ethan was recording at the time, so he played it back immediately. The waveform was perfect, crisp, mechanical. Not an animal, not natural interference. He logged the data and tried to rationalize it. Maybe a buried transponder, part of an old Cold War relay that had never been decommissioned properly. That had happened before. But then, at 3:27 a.m., his handheld radio crackled to life. He hadn't even turned it on. And through the static, a single word came through, clear as day. Below. That was it, no origin. No reply when he asked who it was. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he walked down to the shoreline, climbed across the rocks, and tried to see if any sort of sensor or cabling could have become dislodged. There was nothing. Just seaweed, waves, and jagged basalt stretching out toward the ocean. That night, the signal returned. This time, louder. And as Ethan watched his screen, something changed. The pulses weren't just sonar, they were mapping something. A rhythm, a structure. The screen began forming a loose outline of an object buried beneath the sea floor massive, circular with spindly offshoots. It looked, as he put it, like the skeletal remains of a starfish the size of a house. Ethan backed away from the screen. Every instinct he had was screaming that something was wrong. Then the tower door unlocked itself. He heard the bolt slide. Slow, deliberate. The same door that had been sealed shut for over 40 years. He walked over, hesitant, and sure enough it was slightly ajar. The air inside was ice cold. He entered. The inside of the lighthouse smelled of old rot and rust. Dust hung in the air like spores. As he climbed the steps to the top, he noticed deep scratches in the stone wall-long grooves carved like fingernail marks. But they were reversed, as if someone had been dragged up the stairs, not down. At the top, in the lantern room, the glass had been broken. Shards lay scattered across the floor like teeth. And in the center of the room sat his laptop, the same one he'd left at the shoreline station, open on and playing back his own sonar recording from the night before. 3 pulses, 2, 1. Below. He turned and ran. That night, he didn't sleep. He kept the radio off, the laptop closed. But at 3:12 a.m. exactly, the signal returned. And this time, it was answered. A second signal pinged from the cliffs behind the tower. Then another from beneath the rocks near the tide pools. Then one from inside the lighthouse tower itself. Ethan described it like hearing a chorus of machines trying to speak to each other. Not random, not just noise. A conversation. He packed his things and hiked to the emergency pickup point a full day early. When the extraction team arrived, they found the generator shut down. His sonar gear submerged in salt water and his laptop missing. He never returned to sonar work after that. In his final note to the podcast, he attached an Image 1 final sonar scan he had saved to his phone. It showed the coastline clean and clear, except for a dark void directly beneath the lighthouse. A perfect circle, with smaller circles around it like teeth in a mouth. And underneath, etched faintly in the waveform data, were 6 characters. The time. It always began at exactly 3:12 a.m. Every time.